My name is Byron Johnson. I direct the Institute for Studies of Religion here at Baylor, and we are thrilled to co-sponsor this year's IFL conference. We've done that before, and it's always such a treat to partner with Darren Davis and his team. I just heard the numbers, Darren. Congratulations on pulling this off in a COVID environment. Kudos to you and your team. And so it's my pleasure to get to introduce a dear friend and colleague, Tyler Vanderwill. Tyler is a scholar unlike any that I've ever met before. It seems as if most of us these days specialize in very specific areas of study. Tyler's never met a discipline that he doesn't love or that he hasn't mastered. As you will see shortly, and if you've read his bio, I'm not going to go into the bio. But I will let you know that tomorrow afternoon, he and I both want to invite you to a press conference that will take place here at the conclusion of the conference to announce a new project that Tyler and I have been working on for 3 years to get funded. And it has happened after 3 years of hard work, and I've had the pleasure of working with him very closely, literally hundreds of calls and a few in-person meetings during the last 3 years in spite of the pandemic. And I will say this about Tyler: not only is he one of the world's great scholars, he is one of the most decent and humble people I've ever met. So join me in welcoming to Baylor, Tyler VanderWeele.
Thank you, Byron, for the kind introduction, and thanks to the conference organizers for putting this together and for the invitation to present today on accountability and measurement. So I'll make a few remarks on sort of what I see as the relationship between accountability and measurement, and then go through a number of more practical examples with regard to how assessments of flourishing might contribute to accountability, how assessments of spiritual well-being might contribute to accountability, and the role of a program assessment in accountability. I'll make some remarks on the use of social science methods for religious ends, and then discuss also the limits of measurement, which I think is also a very important topic in interpreting measures. The case studies I'll be going through and discussing the role of measurement in accountability arise in part from some of these papers here on sort of measures of flourishing and Christian spiritual well-being, on sort of forgiveness interventions, and a lot of this work is carried out at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard. More information on that is available on our website. So I'll be taking as a definition of accountability understood as a virtue, and happy to come back to this later and discuss further with those who have more expertise on these matters. But with regard to kind of framing of my discussion, I'll be taking accountability as the habit, in accord with reason, of giving accounts of actions, intentions, and states of affairs to enable the rendering to each his or her due. And so I think if we understood accountability in this way, sort of as a virtue, I think it's possible to be giving accounts too often, but understood as a virtue, something in accord with reason. I think accountability, as has been argued by others here at this conference, is a subtype of justice, understood in Aquinas' terms as a habit whereby a man renders to each one his or due by a constant and perpetual will. So I think it is the case that accountability is a subtype of justice, but I think it also contributes to justice more broadly. Sort of the giving of an account, or the knowledge that one will be expected to do so, can help ensure that one's will is indeed oriented towards giving each his or her due, and can help bring about corresponding just state of affairs. I think the accounts we give often concern our actions and intentions, but I think they also concern states of affairs, how things are, what has resulted from those actions, or the state of affairs that in fact motivated them. And I think when that state of affairs involves some sort of quantitative assessment of something that's not immediately apparent, it becomes proper to speak of measurement. I take measurement as the process of sort of quantitatively assessing one or more properties of some sort of object or phenomena. And so I'll kind of structure my remarks here in a series of 5 propositions, which I will both try to argue for, but also illustrate with examples. The first and perhaps overarching proposition is that measurement will often enable accountability. To see how this might be so, one might imagine a world and trying to act accountably in it, in which sort of schools had no tests, no grades, no competency assessments, or where employment involved no assessment of working hours or productivity, or when household financial management or the management of a community organization, say, involved no log of accounts. And I think this would be living without measurement. Now, it's certainly not impossible, and I think there are instances of each of these phenomena. I think one might even argue that occasionally, at least, there are certain advantages to living without measurement. But I think in general, it makes accountability more difficult for assessing students, say, perhaps especially those who are not doing particularly well or particularly poorly. I think these assessments do help. So I think in general, appropriate measurement will typically enable a sense of accountability and also a sense of progress towards those desired ends. So again, I will kind of try to illustrate this proposition with 3 further sub-propositions going through different aspects of measurement and how they might contribute to accountability. So proposition 2 will thus be societal flourishing can be facilitated by the measurement of well-being, and the measurement of societal well-being would enable greater accountability for those most responsible for the common good. A quote that's often thrown around in sort of measurement circles, which I'm not sure I've traced the origin of it precisely, but some sources at least trace it to Margaret Heffernan. We treasure what we measure. That sort of what we measure really does shape what we talk about, what we discuss, what we know, what we aim for, policies put in place to achieve it. Measurement actually changes the nature of the conversations that we have. And I think we see this at a policy level. We measure very well in this country and elsewhere income, our GDP, physical health, and I think consequently many policy goals are aimed at these outcomes. And I think these are good and important goals, but I think because we do such a better job of measuring GDP and physical health than other aspects of well-being, it really does shape what policies are put into place. And I think ideally as a society, we ought to be aiming higher. We ought to be aiming at flourishing, at sort of living in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. And I think if we did a better job of measuring this at the societal level, it really would alter policy goals and would enable holding policymakers accountable for ends beyond income and physical health. There have been numerous attempts to measure flourishing or well-being that could occupy sort of a whole talk in and of itself, or a whole lecture course in and of itself. So there are numerous assessments available, many of which have developed out of the positive psychology literature, and I think are good for various purposes. But I think because they've arisen out of the psychology literature, they really don't encompass all we might mean by flourishing. Sort of noticeably absent from all these measures of psychological well-being are physical health, and while I don't think physical health coincides with flourishing, I think it is a part of it. So I think to neglect that in thinking about societal well-being is problematic. Also, most of these measures, though not all, neglect character and virtue, which is, of course, sort of central to most of the Western philosophical religious traditions worldwide. So I think we really do need more comprehensive assessment of well-being. It becomes challenging in a pluralistic context like ours, because I think conceptions of flourishing are going to vary across individuals, traditions, and cultures. But what I would argue with respect to measurement of flourishing in a pluralistic context is we might try to focus on what seems to be common to most traditions. And so I would argue that whatever else might be included within the concept of flourishing, the following 5 domains of human life would be included as well. Not that flourishing is reducible to these 5, but that whatever else it might include, it would include these 5 as well. These are happiness, satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Again, the argument's not that this exhausts flourishing, but I think each is a part of it. I think each of these domains also satisfies the following 2 criteria. Each is nearly universally desired, and we have some empirical data on this as well. And each constitutes its own end. Each of these domains is sought for its own sake and not merely as a means to some other end. And I think in pluralistic settings, these 2 criteria, being nearly universally desired, being an end, might help shape consensus around what to measure. So we've introduced kind of a short, crude assessment of flourishing, taking 2 questions in each of these 5 domains, drawn principally from the existing literature on well-being, questions that have received some degree of empirical validation and are already in widespread use. The only domain where really the questions were entirely newly proposed was in the character and virtue domain. While I think there's been a lot of very good work that's been done over the past couple of decades on attempts to assess character, most of the instruments available at present require sort of a rather long questionnaire to assess kind of a single character strength or virtue, courage, or temperance, say, and very little available with regard to more global assessments. And so worked with philosophers to try to develop 2 questions to sort of very crudely, in some sense, assess character based on the tradition of the cardinal virtues, the foundation of all moral virtues lie 4, prudence or practical wisdom, justice, fortitude or courage, moderation or temperance. So 10 questions we've been using are as follows. And these will be a part of the global flourishing study that Byron mentioned as well, along with a number of other well-being character assessments, but the 10 are as follows. First, in the sort of the happiness and life satisfaction domain, how satisfied are you with life as a whole these days? Scored 0 to 10, 0 completely unsatisfied, 10 completely satisfied. This is perhaps the most widely used well-being question in the literature. It's been used in the UK's annual survey, by the OECD, by Gallup at times, by numerous other cohort studies as well. It'll be included in, for the first time in the US Health Interview Survey next year. And then we supplement that with something more effective on feeling happy in general. How happy or unhappy do you usually feel? Once again, 0 to 10, 0 extremely unhappy, 10 extremely happy. Second domain, physical and mental health, questions drawn from the US General Social Survey and the World Health Organization's survey on mental health. Again, questions widely used in the literature. In general, how would you rate your overall physical health? How would you rate your overall mental health? The third domain, meaning and purpose. Overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? This question is likewise widely used in the UK's annual survey, by the OECD, numerous cohort studies. But then we supplement that with something more cognitive. I understand my purpose in life. Fourth domain, character and virtue. First question intended in some very crude way to try to get at wisdom and justice. I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. Scored 0 completely untrue of me to 10 completely true of me. And then a second question intended, again, in some crude way to try to assess fortitude and temperance. I'm always able to give up some happiness now for greater happiness later. And then finally, the fifth domain, close social relationships. 2 questions drawn from the UK's Campaign to End Loneliness survey of short social connectedness instruments. I am content with my friendships and relationships. Again, scored 0 to 10, in some sense trying to get at the quantity of those relationships. And then my relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be, trying to assess the quality of those relationships. In our work, as you'll see, we typically look at these domains separately. Sometimes we will also sort of take the average of these scores as a crude flourishing index, but really this should be understood as nothing more than an average of those 5 more meaningful scores. We typically supplement this with a couple of questions on financial and material stability as important means to sustain those other ends. These questions drawn from the literature on financial well-being. How often do you worry about being able to meet monthly living expenses? 0, worry all the time. 10, do not worry at all. And then how often do you worry about safety, food, or housing? And so again, we'll sometimes look at these all 6 domains, perhaps somewhat less satisfactory conceptually, since financial resources are arguably means, not ends, but perhaps more satisfactory in practice insofar as indicating flourishing over a longer period of time. I think the very act of sort of going through an assessment like this, and we've done this in numerous educational, workplace, clinical settings, can be beneficial just for purposes of self-reflection, even sort of identifying areas where one's not doing as well, where one might want to try to improve, decisions about changes in life. It can be helpful for tracking over time to see what's taking place. Some of the feedback we've had in workplace settings, for example, have been some questions made me stop and think. It was pretty eye-opening to see the areas that I really need to work on, relief that someone is asking, I want help in certain areas, slightly caught off guard with the questions around purpose, missing a greater purpose, need to reach out and to help more and give back. One woman said that after taking this, she finally had decided to commit to volunteering, which she had been intending to do for some time. But in addition to the individual benefits, I think at the community level, it can help leadership see what's going well, what's not, who needs help, what's changing over time. It enables being able to give an account of the current state of affairs with regard to well-being. As an example of this, we collected this sort of data on a sample that was sort of roughly representative of the United States, both prior to the WHO, World Health Organization, declaration of the pandemic in January 2020, and also about 6 months later in June of 2020, in the midst of the pandemic. Prior to the declaration of the pandemic in the United States, across these domains, the average score nationally was really about 7. Out of 10, the one exception being financial and material stability, about a point lower, about 6. Unsurprisingly, during the pandemic, self-reported well-being went down, but affected different domains differently. So again, perhaps unsurprisingly, declines in happiness and life satisfaction, about 0.7 of a point, nearly a full point. Likewise, unsurprisingly, declines in physical and mental health, nearly a point. The largest fall was for financial and material stability, really a full point there. Again, perhaps unsurprisingly, June 2020 was the height of unemployment in the United States as well. But some of the other domains were not affected as substantially. Meaning and purpose went down a bit, but not much. Our character assessments were fairly stable. And somewhat surprisingly, close social relationships declined a little bit, but not very much. And this has been corroborated by other data as well. Sort of reports of loneliness have gone up a bit, but not all that substantially. People have found new ways to connect, either kind of investing in those they're living with, family members, or connecting with the technologies to relatives, perhaps, that hasn't been in touch with. There's evidence that children have felt closer to their fathers during the pandemic. So it really has played out in perhaps in somewhat surprising ways. Importantly, these averages do disguise variability in experience. The variation in all of these domains has gone up during the pandemic. So while for some this has been perhaps a time to more deeply invest in close relationships, for others, perhaps those living alone, this has perhaps been a particularly difficult time. But again, one can get some sense as to what's going well, what's not. How is this changing over time? What still needs to be addressed? So we've been doing this sort of data collection and in workplace settings, employers at Aetna, Kohler, Owens Corning, the World Bank, factory workers in Mexico, Poland, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, China, group of international flight attendants. We've looked at clinical settings, secondary schools, universities, communities. We've embedded these measures in various cohort studies. As I'll mention shortly, we're going to be including them in this global flourishing study. And again, it can provide insights. We see across these various assessments that often financial and material stability is ranked lowest, not in all settings. It was not the case, for example, with our Aetna employees, but in many. This is the sort of the material means are important to people and are not being adequately addressed. Social connection is rated higher in most countries than it is in the United States. We'll have more definitive data on this with the first wave of the Global Flourishing Study, but it should give us, I think, as a country, cause for concern that we are not prioritizing this in our lives. In this more recent work, most of these dimensions increase with age, really up into the 70s, 80s. And this is contrary to some of the earlier work on well-being, which suggested more of a U-shaped pattern with age, those younger and older doing well, those midlife not as well. But it seems that over time that left part of the U has been flattening. Young people are not doing as well as they used to be. And likewise, this is cause for concern. And again, I think these sort of assessments can help with accountability. We understand what is and is not going well, understand who is and is not doing well, who needs help, who needs support. It helps us also understand changes over time. I think if we were to do this at a national level routinely, we'd sort of better understand the state distribution, changes over time with regard to well-being. It would help resolve our ignorance on certain issues. There's been a lot of discussion of having a loneliness epidemic in the United States. But really, until the last few years, there's been inadequate data to know whether this has in fact been rising or has this been sort of a persistent issue for decades. There's some data suggesting it has been going up, but it's challenged on reasonable grounds. And sort of the fact that we simply don't know, I think, means we are not doing adequate measurement of something that is so important to the fabric of our lives. So again, I think these sorts of assessments would help us understand what's taking place and give us a sense as to what needs to be addressed. I think, as per my earlier remarks, it would also help move policy discussion away from a purely material focus on income, on GDP, on physical health to some of these other ends. So again, I think these well-being assessments can help create greater accountability with regard to current state of affairs and how that's changing. But I think accountability is not just of state affairs, but also of actions and intentions. And I think the accounts we give of our actions ought to involve sort of reasons, grounds for the actions we're doing. We want to be able to act effectively. And I think these sorts of well-being assessments can help in that regard as well, and sort of understanding the policy implications of various decisions and understanding the factors that help shape societal flourishing. And so I'll make a few remarks with regard to our literature review to date on sort of the factors that seem to powerfully shape societal flourishing. And I'll be doing this in part through a kind of a public health lens. We often think about the population impact of a particular exposure or phenomena in public health as a function of two things: the prevalence of the exposure, how common it is, and the size of its effects. Something that's very common and that has strong effects on the outcomes we care about are going to powerfully shape population health outcomes. So if we apply this lens to physical health, we're led to factors like exercise, nutrition, not smoking, adequate sleep. But if we broaden the lens and ask not just what shapes physical health, but what shapes the other domains of flourishing as well, what shapes happiness and mental health and meaning and character and close social relationships, I think the list looks rather different. And so based on a review of the literature, I would propose four things being both common and having large effects on the outcomes we care about: family, work, education, religious community. I think there's good empirical evidence that each of these is relatively common, both in the United States and worldwide, and evidence from rigorous longitudinal studies that each of these has important effects on those various flourishing domains. So the argument here is not that these four are exhaustive. Certainly other pathways, I think, contribute to flourishing of individuals. One might say propose the arts for some that may powerfully enhance flourishing in these various domains, but perhaps serious engagement is less common in the general population than some of these other proposed pathways. But in any case, the argument's not that these are exhausted. No, that they're necessary for a given individual. One could flourish even in the absence of one or more of these pathways. Arguments rather that each of these does powerfully affect the flourishing domains, and that if individual or policy efforts were made to enhance these pathways, societal flourishing would increase. More details on sort of the literature review here in the paper in the National Academy of Sciences. I won't bore you with all of the kind of restrictions to this kind of study quality, but this picture sort of shows the evidence from more rigorous studies. These are references to papers, the various pathways, and the 5 flourishing domains. Along with Byron, we've been working these past 3 years on launching sort of a global flourishing study where we're going to collect this sort of data in 22 countries around the globe on a group of about 240,000 individuals with annual data collection over time to try to better understand the pathways that enhance flourishing and how this might vary across cultural contexts. So we'll be able to ask questions like, what are the effects of religion, childhood experiences, family life, community, work, politics, economics, character on various other aspects of human flourishing, and how do they vary by country and context. And again, more if you're interested in the press release event tomorrow following the conference. So returning to kind of second proposition, societal flourishing can be facilitated by the measurement of well-being, and the measurement of societal well-being would enable greater accountability for those most responsible for the common good. Again, I think these flourishing assessments provide accounts of the state of affairs, can give a sense as to what is and is not going well, how this is changing over time, and who needs help. Longitudinal data collected over time can also help us better understand how to improve flourishing. So I think, again, these flourishing assessments can help shape policy to promote the common good and also resist reducing our understanding of that good to simply material goods such as income and physical health. So again, I think they can provide important information for policymakers, can help hold policymakers more accountable. Third proposition, and perhaps more controversial, but I think accountability within religious communities as well as within society might be facilitated by spiritual well-being assessments. And I would argue that the principles are essentially the same here, but apply to different ends, spiritual ends. But I think, likewise, analogously, spiritual well-being assessments can help us understand what is and is not going well, how this is changing over time, who needs help. I think these sorts of assessments can likewise help individuals reflect on their own spiritual lives. And similarly, I think longitudinal studies over time might give insights into how we can improve spiritual well-being. I think such assessments might therefore foster greater accountability in religious communities. So this work is an earlier stage of development. I'll describe a bit about what we've been doing, but I do think to do this well, one needs tradition-specific measures. There are a few measures of kind of generic spiritual well-being floating about the empirical literature, but I think they really don't capture adequately the ends of any particular religious community. And so I think to do this work well, one needs the development of tradition-specific measures. I think if we did have such tradition-specific measures across different world religions, then the use of such assessments might also facilitate greater accountability with regard to policymakers, even in pluralistic contexts such as our own, with regard to is there sufficient religious freedom for these religious communities to pursuing the ends which they deem most important. And there's good evidence that for much of the world's population, religion and spirituality are very important. For many, this is the most important aspect of well-being, and so it does seem reasonable, even from a policy perspective, to ask, are people able to pursue, and are they attaining that which they consider most important? And I think one can sort of challenge more secular mindsets with regard to who are you to say that other individuals ought not to be making progress on what's most important to them. Surely we should be assessing this if we are going to be a well-functioning society. But again, I think to do that in a pluralistic context would require tradition-specific spiritual well-being assessments across the different world religions. So this work is still at a very experimental, early stage of development, and while my own interests are principally on Christian spiritual well-being, we are intending in a few years' time to host a conference once we are a bit further along in the development of our own work with regard to trying to facilitate other world religions doing the same thing, to try to, with time perhaps, bring this to policymakers in a pluralistic context like ours. So we've begun sort of the only place where we have any competence whatsoever at the Human Flourishing Program, which is on a measure of Christian spiritual well-being. You can find sort of this work in a book which just came out with Oxford University Press earlier this year, on measuring well-being. It's a chapter of that book. You can download this for free on their website. But we sort of, a group of us at the Human Flourishing Program proposed a set of items. We then sought feedback from theologians, spiritual directors, priests, pastors, interdisciplinary scholars from Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox perspectives to try to refine the wording of items, to identify what might be missed, to think about the structuring of the domains. We carried out focus groups as well in Protestant and Catholic settings. So this measure has 6 domains: beliefs, practices, service, communion, character, and relationships. It's 30 items, so we also have a short form with just 6. Each of the items is scored either 1 to 7, strongly disagree to strongly agree, or 1 to 10, and we're still sort of experimenting with what seems to be working better. I'll just very briefly run through these, but with regard to beliefs, and again, these are sort of shaped from Christian creeds, but trying to very much simplify wording, as is sort of standard in these surveys. But I believe in one God as 3 persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I believe that through Jesus Christ's life, death, and resurrection, God brought salvation. I believe that God brings grace, the Holy Spirit, and the church. I believe Jesus will return to fully bring life everlasting. I believe that the scriptures of the Old and New Testament guide us to salvation. And in this work and in the item refinement, there's quite a bit of discussion back and forth, both at the second stage with sort of pastors and priests and theologians, but also at the third stage with the focus groups on trying to sort of navigate between Catholic and Protestant understandings of some of these. One could imagine sort of yet more specific and particular tradition-specific assessments as well. At this stage, we tried to keep this ecumenical. Practices: I intentionally take time each day to practice prayer. I regularly devote time to learn about my faith. I regularly attend church services, participate in the sacraments such as Eucharist or Holy Communion as an important part of my Christian faith. I regularly reflect on my life to understand what I have done wrong and how to improve. Confessing my sins is an important part of my spiritual life. Service: I help those in need as a way of living out my Christian faith. I use the gifts God has given me to support the Christian community. I tell others who are not Christian about my faith. I give financially what I should, and use my resources in ways that advance the kingdom of God. Union with God: I have come closer to God through my prayer and spiritual practices. I intentionally seek God's presence in my daily life. I am growing in my understanding of who God is. I have a meaningful relationship with God. God loves me and cares about me. Christian character: I always have complete faith in God's plan of salvation. My hope in God directs all of my desires and actions. I love God above all else. My calling to be a Christian guides my life's work. I try to actively improve good habits and combat sinful ones. I allow the Holy Spirit to guide me in growing holiness in life. Relationships, the final domain, I love my neighbor as myself. I have forgiven those who have hurt me. There are people in my life with whom I talk to about deep spiritual matters. There are people in my community who regularly support me in my faith. And then we've taken one item from each of these 6 domains also to produce a short form of this assessment as well. So again, this is still in early stages. We've collected data on this in participants of various Catholic student centers around the country, as well as members of a Presbyterian church in New York. And in terms of sort of where we're at and some of what has emerged from this thus far is that, especially in the beliefs domain, but certainly in the others as well, some evidence for ceiling effects. Too many people reporting kind of 10 out of 10, so perhaps some of these questions and items are not as sensitive as one might hope for. With regard to comparing the domains with one another, and this is potentially cause for concern and may have reflected after Carpenter's talk last session. The scores on service and on character are notably lower in both of these samples than they are for beliefs, practices, communion, relationships. For practices, the scores on prayer and on learning about the faith were lower than attendance, Eucharist, reflection, or confessing sins. And for relationship, the scores on loving one's neighbor and forgiveness were considerably lower than for having spiritual discussions or having support within the Christian community. In the Catholic Student Center study, we are collecting data on the same sample over time to try to get some sense, again, as to what factors might influence these various aspects of spiritual well-being. We're also doing some preliminary work on trying to develop perhaps more stringent assessments, avoiding these issues of ceiling effects potentially, and trying to come up with items corresponding to the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, drawing principally on Aquinas' understanding of those. So coming back to the third proposition, accountability within religious communities and within society might be facilitated by spiritual well-being assessments. Again, I think these sorts of assessments might help pastors and priests better understand what is and is not going well, how is this changing over time, who needs help. And I think, again, some of these assessments are one approach, certainly not the only approach or even the most important approach, but one approach to facilitate providing an account of the state of affairs in churches or other religious settings. And I think this sort of data could affect decisions about kind of the content of sermons and homilies, what needs to be addressed within this particular community, what sorts of programs to offer, what sort of staff need to be hired. And so again, I think might help foster accountability within churches. And as I commented earlier, I think potentially, and this would be more of a long-term ambition, foster accountability amongst policymakers. This would, in a pluralistic context, require these sorts of spiritual well-being assessments across traditions, but once again might facilitate assessments with regard to our religious liberty sufficient for religious communities to make progress towards what they perceive as their most important ends. So again, I think these spiritual well-being assessments might help foster accountability with regard to the state of affairs, but I think also have the potential to foster accountability with regard to the actions we take or the programs that we offer within religious settings. So fourth proposition I will offer is that accountability within religious and other communities can be facilitated by the measurement and evaluation of the effects of programs. So in public health and medicine, for any sort of intervention that's going to see widespread use, we first want to evaluate it in a randomized trial. From everything from vaccines to cancer treatments, we want to know with the most rigorous designs whether or not they work before distributing them to thousands or millions of people. It's often the case that well-intentioned, even well-reasoned actions and interventions can fail to have their intended effects. And we really need accountability with regard to the consequences of our actions, interventions, and programs. We, once again, need measurement. Now, this sort of approach might seem a bit far-fetched in religious communities. I've sometimes joked with pastor and priest friends, well, you could randomize spiritual retreat A and spiritual retreat B, and then 6 months later see who's praying more. But sort of only half-jokingly. I mean, I think this sort of thing could potentially take place. And I'll make some comments a little bit later on when I think such an approach is versus is not reasonable. But to demonstrate its feasibility, I'd like to talk a bit about the work that's been done over the past 3 decades and that we're doing right now on forgiveness interventions. And again, this is a topic which we've seen from our spiritual well-being assessments, in fact, needs some work within the Christian community. It was one of the domains that was scored relatively low compared to the others. So I'll talk a little bit about forgiveness, the work that's kind of led to the development of these interventions, and what we're doing right now with regard to randomized trials on forgiveness. And then I'll return again to the broader question as to how might these sorts of approaches and principles be used more broadly. When are they and are they not reasonable? So forgiveness is sometimes conceived of as a victim's reducing negative thoughts, emotions, tensions, and behaviors and replacing those with positive thoughts, emotions, intentions, and behaviors towards the offender. Or simpler definition, I prefer replacing ill will towards the offender with goodwill. Understand as such, forgiveness is then different from forgetting the action or condoning it or excusing it or simply forbearing. It's different from reconciling, at least in this life. It's different from not demanding justice. One can forgive, desire the ultimate good for the offender, yet still pursue a just outcome. And I think these points are important when considering the dissemination of forgiveness interventions. A distinction, I think an important one, sometimes also drawn between decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness. I think this is important both at a conceptual level, but also with regard to measurement. So decisional forgiveness, behavioral intention to forego revenge and treat the offender as a person of value. Emotional forgiveness, so decisional forgiveness is really an act of the will. Emotional forgiveness, replacement of negative, unforgiving emotions with positive, other-centered emotions. So I think this distinction helps to understand how we can have a command to forgive. That's really the decisional forgiveness, even though we don't have complete control over our own feelings, over our own emotions. I think it can also help make sense of the phenomena of feeling one has forgiven and yet 2 days later feeling that anger. Again, the decisional forgiveness will often precede and help bring about that emotional forgiveness, so one can imagine circumstances when in fact the emotional forgiveness does take place without that commitment, that decision. So there have been various scales to try to assess forgiveness. I'm not going to go into great detail, but again, attempts at measuring forgiveness. I think not all of the items in all of these scales are necessarily satisfactory. I think some are quite good, like even though his or her action hurt me, I have goodwill for him or her. Or I wish good things to happen to the person who wronged me. I think with others, it's somewhat more complex. I'll make him or her pay, or I have released my anger so I can work on restoring our relationship to health. I think maybe conflating reconciliation, which is sometimes perhaps appropriate, but may not always be with forgiveness. So there may be more refinement to do on forgiveness measurement, but there are a number of measures out there. A lot of the research is sort of cross-sectional, where all the data has been collected at once, but there are longitudinal studies suggesting that forgiveness itself improves happiness and life satisfaction, self-esteem, emotional processing and expression, depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, improves the likelihood of volunteering. And I think the mechanisms are often thought to be forgiveness being a better response, a more adequate response to a wrong than rumination, returning to the offense again and again, or suppression Still debate, I would say, as to its effects on physical health, some evidence, but not entirely clear. But the effects on mental health seem fairly well established. And even stronger evidence for this comes from randomized trials of forgiveness interventions, programs to try to facilitate forgiveness for those who want to forgive and are having trouble doing so. There are a couple of models that have been widely used in the literature. Enright's process model, Worthington's reach model. I think they're not all that different at the most fundamental level. But Enright's process model is sort of organized in 20 steps and 4 phases, uncovering negative feelings about the offense, letting to surface a decision to pursue forgiveness for a specific instance, sort of that commitment to decisional forgiveness, and working towards understanding the offending person, discovery of unanticipated positive outcomes, empathy for the forgiving person. These sorts of interventions have been shown in randomized trials to be effective with as diverse and sometimes difficult populations as adult incest survivors, patients struggling with having adopted special needs children, patients with alcohol and drug addictions. Second model, and this is the one we've been working with at the Human Flourishing Program, is Worthington's REACH model, where each letter of REACH, R-E-A-C-H, corresponds to step in the process. R, and again, I think there are a lot of similarities between the two models. R, recall the hurt and experience, the emotions associated with it. E, empathize with the offender, take the other's perspective, consider reasons for their action, again, without condoning the action or invalidating one's own feelings. A, altruistic gesture of recalling one's own shortcomings and realizing that others have offered forgiveness to oneself, that forgiveness is a gift that can be offered or not. C, commitment to forgive, make that commitment it's already taken place, and also knowing that forgiveness will still be required. And then H, hold on to or maintain that forgiveness through times of uncertainty, through the returning of anger and bitterness, realizing that emotional forgiveness will take time. So there have been kind of meta-analyses of trials, randomized trials, looking at forgiveness interventions, suggesting moderately large effects on improving forgiveness for those who receive these interventions. Longer interventions, perhaps unsurprisingly, tend to have stronger effects. Individually focused interventions tend to be more effective than couple or group, but those have had effects as well. In addition to improving forgiveness itself, there's evidence that these interventions reduce anxiety, reduce depression, increase hope. And so these results really do provide largely experimental evidence that these interventions are effective, not only for promoting forgiveness, but for also addressing mental health. Now, most of these forgiveness interventions require multiple sessions with a trained therapist or counselor, so widespread dissemination is costly, but over the last few years, there's been work on trying to distill the principles from these interventions, from 30 years of work in clinical psychology on forgiveness, into workbook forms. There's been a couple of small trials now on these forgiveness workbooks suggesting, again, moderately large effects on forgiveness, to try to really more definitively establish the effectiveness of these workbooks, and especially of a sort of a shorter version of these workbooks that only takes 2 or 3 hours. The older workbooks would take 6, and the proportion that actually completed were not as substantial as one might hope. So I'm really trying to distill this to perhaps a yet simpler form. We're currently running a randomized trial of one of these REACH workbook interventions that's intended to take 2 or 3 hours amongst 3,000 participants in Colombia, South Africa, Ukraine, Hong Kong, and Indonesia, looking at effects of these workbook interventions on forgiveness, but also on depression, anxiety, hope, and on the various domains of flourishing. One can download these books freely from Everett Worthington's website, the ones we're testing in the randomized trial. I've worked through them myself, found it very, very helpful. But again, if this is effective, if the evidence is clear that these workbooks do effectively promote forgiveness and effectively reduce depression and anxiety, I think a case could then potentially be made that forgiveness should be considered at a societal level a public health issue. The experience of being wronged is very common, and it looks as though the effects of forgiveness on mental health are substantial. And so, I think if these workbooks are effective, they could be widely disseminated and might also help heal some of the social and political divides that we've seen. And so again, I think before we do widespread dissemination of a particular tool, it's good to evaluate it in a randomized trial like this, good to try to achieve accountability. So I'll come back then again to my fourth proposition. Accountability within religious and other communities can be facilitated by the measurement and evaluation of the effects of programs. I think we're often prone to let ourselves off the hook for ineffective actions. And I do think this sort of formal program evaluation allows for a greater accountability with regard to our actions and the programs that we undertake. Now, I don't think this is appropriate for all contexts. Running a trial like this is extremely arduous and expensive, so it's not as though anything we try we need to test in a randomized trial first, but I think anything that's being proposed for really widespread use, once we're thinking about dissemination to tens of thousands or millions of people, I think evaluation in a randomized trial is worthwhile, and I think would be the case in churches and in religious communities. Given the cost, I think it may make sense to sort of pool resources to do this, both with regard to the development of tools that might help promote spiritual well-being, and then also in testing this. And I think doing so, having both systems and structures for the measurement and assessment of spiritual ends, but also for the development of programs, I think might move us towards what might be a social science for religious or spiritual ends. So I'm going to hazard a few remarks on this topic, but this is really now extending well beyond my own area of expertise. But again, I think really churches, religious communities could benefit from turning the tools of social and biomedical sciences to spiritual ends. I think one could kind of envision, say, a Christian social science or religiously informed social science perspectives. I do think doing so adequately, again, does require an attempt to quantify those ends while addressing the limitations of trying to do so. But I think doing so and then evaluating actions, programs, and so on, I think could help promote the ends of the church. I do think a fully fledged Christian social science would also require a theology of society and a theology of social science itself. I do think the Compendium of Social Doctrine of the Church really does provide quite an extraordinary theology of society. Every time I turn to it, I come away deeply enriched. But I think there's a lot more work to be done, certainly on kind of coming up with an adequate theology of social science itself, along with kind of how might a religiously informed social science engage with more methodologically naturalist forms of social science? How do we allow space for, say, a Christian understanding of the work of the Holy Spirit in guiding the church in the lives of individuals within the context of social scientific research? So a lot more work would need to be done. A lot more could be said on this topic. There are many who are far more expert on these matters than myself, but I do think it would be worthwhile to explore these directions further. In my view, sort of approach really is simply reason serving the ends of faith. And I finally want to conclude with some remarks on the limits of measurement. An important quote from Albert Einstein in this regard: "Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted." Sometimes also paraphrased as "not everything that can be measured matters, not everything that matters can be measured." And so, again, I think it's important to consider the limits of measurement. So my fifth and final proposition is that proper interpretation of measurement requires an understanding of that which cannot be quantified or measured. So in my view, while we've not been sufficiently ambitious with regard to what we've attempted to measure concerning psychological, social, spiritual phenomena, while I think more work can be done, while I think more progress can be made, we really do need to acknowledge the limitations of measurement, limitations in the process of measurement itself. A lot of our own work, though there are modes of measurement that extend beyond this, but a lot of our own work is survey-based, and one has concerns about self-report biases, sort of social desirability, responding in the way one is expected to, or self-deception. This can be particularly problematic, say, with character assessments. There are ways to address some of these by looking at kind of changes in the self-reports of the assessments over time, say, but they are issues that need to be taken into account. Challenges in comparability across contexts, especially when doing cross-cultural work. Are these items understood? Is the scale being interpreted in the same way? And so importantly, I think measures are not either valid or invalid. They're valid or invalid for a particular use. I think if we're trying to use these sorts of measures to compare one person to another, that is not an adequate use because, again, this is subject to these biases and also to differences in interpretation. But for a use where you're looking at the same individual over time to see what's improving and what's not, I think that is a reasonable use, and is a reasonable use even in the context of some of these self-report biases. Likewise, in the context of a randomized trial, these self-report biases are going to be balanced across groups by randomization. They do not threaten the use of these measures in those contexts. So, but again, there are limitations in the process of measurement. There are limitations also in the objects of measurement. I mean, one might say sort of the presence and operation of God's grace is not something we're going to be able to measure. Perhaps measure some of the effects of that at best, but sort of not present. So awareness of what cannot be measured. I think also limitations with regard to the scope of measurement. Before, I would define measurement as the process of quantitatively assessing one or more properties of some object or phenomena, but it does not characterize the entirety of the phenomena. There's always something missing from measurement. And I think a lot of these measures really cannot adequately deal with unusual, idiosyncratic, unique experiences. I think there's a real need for qualitative data, for narrative accounts. Measurement is always going to be partial. It's always reductive. The phenomena themselves are always more complex, and we must have that awareness when interpreting the results of our measures. What is being missed? What are we not capturing? What are we not asking about? And as I commented earlier, then limitations also on the feasibility of measurement. Measurement can be costly. Formal evaluation is even more costly. Time and financial resources are limited. So I think we need to be strategic about what we measure, how we measure it, how extensively, how often. I also think measurement shouldn't be imposed. I hope sort of nothing I've said here would suggest that religious communities must always engage in measurement. I just don't think that's so. I don't think measurement should be viewed as a constraint that we can't act without measurement. I think it's more of an opportunity. It's a sort of an invitation to more formal assessment of certain aspects, not the whole of, but certain aspects of those things that we care about. So I view it as an opportunity rather than as a constraint. And then there are limitations also with regard to the implications of measurement. We care not only about, sort of in terms of accountability, the state of affairs and the consequences of action, but also their motivation. Again, we need other sorts of accounts. So I do think measurement can facilitate accountability, but accountability, of course, extends beyond measurement. But I think in understanding the limitations of measurement, understanding its limitations with regard to its processes, its objects, its scope, its feasibility, its implications, I think by understanding those limitations can help allow us to use measurement to promote rather than to hinder accountability. So, in conclusion, there are 5 propositions that I've put forward. I'm happy to have a discussion, critique of these, but first, measurement will often enable accountability. Second, societal flourishing can be facilitated by the measurement of well-being. Measurement of societal well-being would enable greater accountability of those most responsible for the common good. Accountability within religious communities and within society might be facilitated by spiritual well-being assessments. Accountability within religious communities and other communities can be facilitated by the measurement and evaluation of the effects of programs, and then the proper interpretation of measurement requires an understanding of that which can be quantified or measured. So again, I think measurement's it's a tool, but it is a tool that when well used, I think can facilitate accountability, which I think is both a part of, but also further contributes to justice. I think knowing when to make use of measurement and when not to itself requires prudence, practical wisdom, but I do think accountability and measurement both have a place in a well-ordered life and well-ordered society. I think using measurement well may also potentially assist in attaining appropriate ends that extend well beyond that which can be measured. That concludes my presentation. Thank you all for being here and for listening. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks. My name is Brent Fessler. I'm in the education program here, the EDD program. Very near and dear to my heart. It strikes me as using measurement for more micro individual accountability situations, how that might address some of the inflation of scores or the ceiling of scores if I'm coming into an assessment as an individual to be assessed as an outward score versus I'm coming into an assessment for the purpose of my own growth. Yep. And are there any studies that are more looking at that micro scale rather than a broad efficacy of programs?
Yeah, I mean, much of the work we've been doing in educational settings to date have in fact been more oriented towards personal growth, reflection, tracking over time, rather than kind of evaluation of a program as to how it might enhance flourishing. I do think there's a role for both, but I think with these self-report assessments, one has to be careful in general, but perhaps in educational settings especially, not to employ them in high-stakes settings. I think sort of flourishing assessments, character assessments, I think they have a role. I think they can be important for reflection. I think they can be important for understanding what's taking place within the community. But as soon as something depends on the scores that are reported, the whole game falls apart. So if you're kind of deciding whether to reward school A or school B based on which one's improving their flourishing scores more, it's going to be a disaster because there will be motivation then to over-report. So I think it really is important that these sort of self-report assessments are kept out of high-stake settings. That, again, it doesn't preclude their use with regard to personal growth and reflection, nor to randomized trial assessment of kind of program A or program B. But I think in terms of use in high-stake settings, it really does need to be avoided.
I have a question about the spiritual well-being measure. Looking at the specific items and for several different domains, and I immediately thought about the Fetzer Institute Religiousness and Spirituality measure. And we typically tend to think of well-being as an outcome of religiousness, but your concept of spiritual well-being seems to combine both. So my question is, how do you conceptually distinguish between what we traditionally call religiousness or religiosity, spirituality, from your concept of spiritual well-being?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I mean, the intent of this spiritual well-being assessment was to evaluate spiritual well-being essentially as an outcome, sort of how well from sort of a Christian perspective, is this person doing in spiritual life, what is going well, what is not, but treated principally as an outcome. I think the Fetzer's brief multidimensional measure of religion and spirituality, a lot of that work was motivated by really religion and spirituality as an exposure or as an independent variable to look at how does religion and spirituality, say, affect health as an outcome. Now, I mean, in principle, one can use various aspects of either assessment as an outcome or as an exposure treatment, an independent variable. I mean, one could use, say, a sense of being loved by God, which here in this measure is being principally treated as an outcome. One could use that as an exposure and see how does that go on to affect charitable giving. One could do that from a research perspective, but the motivation with regard to the development of this measure was to develop something that would be used principally, though not necessarily exclusively, as an outcome, whereas I think the motivation for the Fetzer project was really the reverse, though there are some items in common, certainly.
Hi, Tyler. My name is Charlotte Whitfleet, and it is a pure delight to witness your talk today, and I thank you for all of your intentionality and in framing and building accountability into the interpretive framework so that when we conduct assessments and we look at the measurement outcomes, that actually is part of a feedback loop that then should shape how we then respond and reassess. So I really valued that. I want to ask you now about the value that you might imagine for actually also assessing accountability as part of flourishing. So rather than seeing accountability as sort of the invisible framework that we can engage in when we're looking at these data, what might be the value, especially as we consider religiosity, relationality, as we live our lives before God, as we live our lives in relationship to others, how we give others what they're due. What about the value of assessing accountability to the transcendent and accountability to other people in the kind of work you're doing, including the Global Flourishing Project?
Yeah. Thank you. No, I would be fully in favor of the assessment of accountability as well. As I commented earlier, our flourishing assessment is a very crude one. It was intended to be very short so that it could be embedded in multiple other surveys and assessments, possibly aimed at different with different purposes, but in each of those domains, I think much richer measurement and assessment is possible. So we've been doing a fair bit of additional work on the measurement of meaning and purpose, trying to distinguish between the two, purpose being more end-directed, meaning understanding the greater context of things, and then drawing further distinctions with the philosophical literature. Of course, once one moves into the character and virtue domain, the possibilities are very substantial indeed, and I would view the development of measures of accountability as sort of falling within that domain, but assessing particular character strengths or virtues. I do think the assessment of character by self-report is challenging. I think certain aspects of character are perhaps more amenable to assessment by self-report. We've found one of the two items in our own flourishing assessment on character has worked pretty well, the one that sort of always seek to do good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. But as we've experimented with other items on, say, practical wisdom, it's not clear if we're picking up that or if we're picking up pride. And so again, I think assessment of some aspects of character, I might put honesty or humility amongst them, is more challenging, I think, than others. I tend to think, and this is pure speculation at this point, and you could perhaps speak more to this than me, but I tend to think accountability might be one of those where it is possible to make reasonable progress, where it is possible to have a sort of a process of reflection that takes place in posing questions, where the sort of the social desirability biases don't completely overwhelm the information that is provided in those responses. And I think if one had good measures of accountability, I think including those as part of, say, anything from kind of leadership assessments to opportunities for individual, personal self-reflection, to evaluating what sorts of programs can help improve and increase accountability. I think all of those would be rendered potentially feasible by accountability measurement. So I would be fully in favor, understood as sort of an aspect of character, of virtue, to proceed with accountability measurement as well.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. Early on you said that we tend to perhaps pay more attention to, and as a public policy matter, focus on things that we measure or measure well, like GDP and physical health. And that strikes me as right and plausible. But then I thought of a sort of a counterexample. It seems like we measure climate and climate change pretty well, but it doesn't seem to have much of an impact on public policy. I'm not suggesting that you would have thought there was some sort of law of nature here or anything like that. But any thoughts about the gap between, you might say, getting information and motivating policymakers and the general population to, let's say, move in a direction?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I don't think measurement is necessary or sufficient for receiving attention, for creating a sense of value, for action, or for effective action. I think measurement can facilitate all of those things, but again, I don't think measurement's necessary or sufficient for it. With regard to climate change, I do think that the quantitative measurement of what's taking place has really shaped discussion over it. That's different than action, and that's different yet again than effective action. But I mean, I think many people consider this one of the pressing issues with regard to life in the world today. So I mean, I do think measurement has accomplished that. I think some of the debates and disputes over climate change, which again in some ways relate to measurement, is how much of this is due to human versus other causes, how much is preventable and is not, and how does that vary depending on the other ends that we're after. And I think those are difficult questions to fully address, but I think the more clarity that we have on those questions based on scientific assessment and measurement, both of sort of climate change and the societal impacts, but also kind of evaluating what would have to be done to alter course in different directions and sort of what are the implications of that for other aspects of human life. I think the more that can be established, measured, if you will, the clearer it will be what we're talking about. There will be less talking past one another. So again, I do think the measurement around climate change has created and generated a great deal of discussion. Not yet effective action, but again, that is a second stage, and one that I think is important, and that the tools of science help us to address.
I'm Shirley Rules, and I'm director of an international network. But my question really goes back to number 2 about how social flourishing can be facilitated by the measurement of well-being. And I'm thinking about, I'd be interested in your response to the question of who are the interpreters between the actual measurement and the people receiving communications about social flourishing. My observation has been with the recent pandemic that some of the interpreters, I've read some really bad articles in blogs and newspapers because people don't understand basic statistics. And they throw numbers around, and you get to the bottom, you think, I have no idea what they just really tried to say. And I have some training in statistics, and I don't know what they were trying to say. And particularly when you get into religious environments, who's the bridge between the measurement and communicating to people about social flourishing and how we might improve social flourishing? What kinds of people need to be trained to do this? What do they need to know? So it's a little bit beyond what you were presenting today, but I think the way we get from measurement to better social flourishing is by all those people who have to be the bridges in the process.
Yeah, no, I very much agree that process of interpretation is an important one, and one that requires some training. I don't think there's any one group or entity responsible for that interpretation and communication. I think both in the pandemic and society and life in general, and concerning well-being, there are going to be multiple parties doing that interpretation and communication, from sort of the government to local organizations, to religious communities, to schools, to families even. And sort of individuals also make their own interpretations. Now, I don't think everyone's called to have a detailed knowledge of statistics, but I do think the broader one's communication and influence, the greater responsibility there is for interpreting properly, the greater accountability that such a person or group should be held to. I think certainly some of this goes on with regard to government communications. I think more could be done in this regard, both there, but perhaps especially concerning media communications, which I think is also a source of a lot of information and interpretation. I think we should be holding media more accountable for societal well-being. But I do think we should be holding churches and religious communities accountable as well. And at least in this country, they still have enormous influence. And I think it's important in those communications to interpret the data, whether that's going to be flourishing or spiritual well-being or something related to public health, and interpreting that well. And again, I think potentially moving towards a form of spiritually oriented or Christian social science could help facilitate that, having sort of social scientists concerned with the ends and the life of church or religious communities. Again, there's more to be done. I would, to my mind, both work within churches and religious communities, but also with the media, especially, I think would be very valuable in this regard, assisting in that process of interpretation.